You can take it over.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So can everyone hear me? Stacey, we're good with the audio?
I can hear you.
Perfect. So welcome everyone, and thank you. We're a couple of minutes late. As always with meetings, we have a little bit of technical issues, but it was all on my side, so I do apologize. Thank you so much for sticking around as well for this section. I know it's the last session of the day. I think it's the last session of the whole conference, from what I understand. So yeah, great work by all of the organizers. I think this is a new world for everyone with these virtual events. So a couple of things before we begin. Firstly, let's thank the sponsors. It's a new world at the moment with these virtual events. So if you do have time, going in and visiting some of the sponsors will be great as well. And also speaker feedback as well is super, super useful. So today for this session, we are going to talk about information architecture, the building blocks. This is a session that really is designed to help give you an understanding of what information architecture is and how can it be applied to your intranet on SharePoint Online as well as SharePoint on-premise. We're not going to get super technical in this session. We're not going to go into PowerShell. We're not going to do much configuration, but really the idea is to give you more of a broader sense of how to best structure content within your organization so you can surface that through your intranet so your users can find what they want when they need it also. So a little bit about myself before we begin. My name is Michal Pisarek. I'm one of the co-founders at Orchestry Software, which is a new product that we are launching to the market fairly soon. I was a 6 times Microsoft SharePoint MVP, and before I had Orchestry, I was actually a founder of a SharePoint-based intranet company, which got acquired close to 2 years ago now. So I have lots of experience in a lot of intranet projects for the last probably 7 years of my consulting life and my product life. It was really around helping organizations deploy some fairly large intranets. So everything we worked, experience from everything from smaller companies of 200 people or 100 people, all the way up to some really large organizations of 150,000, 200,000 users. We were also lucky enough that a lot of the clients that we worked with actually won awards. So we had 2 clients that won their Nielsen Norman Intranet Awards, which we were really, really proud of. And a lot of the techniques and the tools I'm going to go through today are tools and techniques that we used, to help organizations create a structure for their intranet in terms of the navigation, in terms of landing pages that they have, the metadata, the content authoring structure, to make all of that work. Because if you're a smaller organization, you don't have to have as much, as much work into that. But if you're a really large multinational and you want an intranet to be applicable to every single user within your organization, there's a lot of upfront planning work that needs to be done. And I think there's a lot of materials out there on the technical side, how to configure things, how to configure hub sites and communication sites, team sites and navigation. There's a lot around the configuration piece, but there's not so much of, well, what should I actually be configuring, right? How do I get to that point where I'm creating a really intuitive navigation menu? My pages are all set up correctly, and I have metadata there that I can drive whatever I need to. So for the agenda today, we are going to talk about the first thing about elements of information architecture. So we're going to take a bit of a step back. For a lot of organizations that I have worked with, information architecture can be a fairly nebulous sort of term. So we really want to ground that term and that saying first. So we're going to talk about what information architecture is. Then we're going to take it a step down and talk about information architecture in particular for SharePoint intranets and talk about the 3 main things that you'll be looking at. So that is your site structure, your metadata, and also what we call landing pages, or how your pages are going to be designed for your intranet. The next thing and the last 2 things is really around tools and techniques. This is something that I think a lot of organizations don't know that you can use, but there's tools and techniques out there that allow you to create an information architecture like a navigation structure and allow you to test that before you launch your intranet. So a really common question is, how do we know that what we come up with from the perspective of organizing content is going to work? And if you think about it, on the public side or the public facing side, a lot of these tools have been used for quite a while, but I think it's really time to bring these tools on the intranet side. And we're going to talk about a couple of tools that we've used and we think they give fantastic results. Tools like automated card sorting and tree testing, all of these particular tools that you can use. And then, like I said, those tools and techniques, and they'll be rolled into those pragmatic information architecture activities also. So really my goals for everyone watching the session today is to understand what information architecture is and more so understand how it's applied to SharePoint intranet. I'm going to talk a lot about best practices in terms of structuring sites, content and metadata, that best practices from the perspective of organizing that content. Even though intranets haven't been around for years, they've been around for like 20 or 30 years now. So there's a lot of best practices that you can apply in terms of how your navigation structure should be set up, what types of metadata you might need, and how many different types of metadata you might require for your intranet. And also the last thing around how pages should be organized. So we'll talk about that. We're going to talk about tools and techniques that you can use. And lastly, I always like going to sessions where we offer some fairly pragmatic advice is offered. And that's really what I hope for you listening to this today, that at the end of the session, there's going to be things that you can go and you can take back to your organization or to your company that you can use straight away. So in terms of information architecture, what is it? So this is the high level term. The information architecture is the art and science of structuring, labeling, and categorizing content. Really, when I think of information architecture in my mind is organizing content in a way that users can find what they need when they need it in the most logical and efficient manner. And information architecture is really, from a SharePoint perspective, applied to everything that you have. So the navigation structures that you have, the types of metadata that you use, the types of content that you have within your intranet also, whether it's news, policies, procedures, forms, templates, all of those things as well. But really the whole idea is you want to get a good understanding of all of your content so you can structure it in a way that is not just going to make sense to the intranet team that's working on the project, is not just going to make sense to the IT team, but is going to make sense to everyone within your organization. So let's talk about the elements of information architecture first. And there's really three things that contribute to developing a really good information architecture, a really good structure around your content. And that is users, the people that are actually going to be accessing that information, the organizational context. This to me is the most interesting one. So how does an organization think about information? How is an organization organized also from a hierarchical or a department-based perspective? And finally, the content. The content really contributes to how you're going to structure your information. So if we think about users first, the biggest tip that I would say is you need to get your users involved very early in any intranet initiative. In the end, you're building the intranet, not just a sort of esoteric exercise, you're building it for your end users. So when we do intranet projects, we try to get users involved very, very early on. And the types of questions what we want to ask are who are going to be the users of the intranet, what information is important to them, the types of tasks that are trying to complete, where they're physically located, and of course how they're going to access their intranet. And really understanding your users is key to providing that really intuitive experience. What I found in my experience working with a lot of organizations is there's a lot of tension, right? There's a bit of tension there between the intranet team or the team that's building the intranet versus what those end user needs are. And it becomes fairly apparent if you look into something like a homepage. So typically most intranet projects are owned by internal comms. For internal communications, things like news and events and stories are really, really important. Typically that intranet is seen as a corporate communications vehicle. But when we go and ask users what's important to them, a lot of the times they say that news and events are important, but what they're really looking for is more of a task-based approach, certain things that they want to do. So I want to see how many days off I have. I want to get access to all of the work tools that I need to perform my particular job duties. That could be things like forms, policies, procedures, and various tools, for instance. And also there's a couple of really common, more, I guess, social things that a lot of users want to see. In a lot of intranets that we built, the lunch menu was one of the most popular items on the intranet. Things like what today's Wi-Fi password was really, really popular. And the other thing that we found was, like the ability to request vacation days or leaves. So once again, understanding those users and asking them really early on what's important to them allows you to make sure that you're building an information architecture, a structure that's going to balance that between what the corporate side needs in terms of we want to use the intranet as a way to push news and events or other types of initiatives within the organization versus what users need from a pragmatic, practical, day-to-day perspective. The next is around context. Now, context is a really interesting one because context is the reason why you can't take the same structure to every organization in terms of navigation and pages and hierarchy and hope it's going to work. And every organization is a little bit different in terms of who they are, what they believe, how they communicate, and what they're trying to achieve. So a few things that we would ask for from a context perspective. The first is there any specific line of business content to highlight? So an intranet can be a great way to promote things like initiatives within the organization. Maybe there's certain things that you want to do. Of course, with the time of COVID now, using that intranet as a communication vehicle for COVID-based information and maybe COVID-based changes to the workspace, like working from home. Understanding all of this, like I said, is going to help you really craft that structure around your intranet in a way that's going to make more sense. You also want to understand the communication style that the organization uses. And this is particularly important when we talk about navigation structure. So is the communication style very formal? Is it informal? Or is it a mix? Because from here, you're going to understand the types of, like I said, labels that you're going to use, and also the types of content you might want to have available on home pages. So a really good example of that is you might be working in more of a formal based organization where everything is fairly formal, news, events, policies, procedures, and there might not be too much of a capability there for end users to provide things like comments or provide their own content. Alternatively, you might work at a very social organization, and what we've found in that respect is more of the social organizations, the ones which are more informal, they lean much more to having more community or user-generated content. So maybe you're looking at things like Yammer to have on your homepage. Maybe some of the labels that you use are a little bit softer. So instead of using, let's say, human resources as a label for that type of HR content, you might use something like employee services for instance. The final thing just to touch upon is around any particular labels or terminology that are familiar to users. One tip that I would give is to avoid things like acronyms on intranets, especially from a navigation perspective. Acronyms work really well for users that have been with the organization for a considerable amount of time. But if you're new to an organization, we've seen these in navigation menus and on pages, and everything's like a 3-letter acronym and it's really difficult to find what that acronym is. That can be problematic also. So once again, the context piece is understanding that organization, how they think and how they are structured. And then the final part of information architecture is really around content. So what content should be available on the intranet and how should it essentially appear there? One of the first activities that we would typically do, or that I would typically do on an intranet initiative, is do something called a content audit. The idea is that you go and you audit not all of the content within your organization, but at least the types of content that you want to make publicly available. So, and the reason for that is that's going to give you a really good understanding in terms of what content you have. It's going to also probably give you a good understanding of the types of content that people are using, and that's going to help you structure that content more effectively. But from an intranet perspective, typically intranet content produced by few authors for many readers. You want that content to be final and authoritative also. You want the intranet to be the place where people go for authoritative content. So if I do a search for let's say the latest benefits policy, I know that regardless if I find 27 versions of that scattered throughout teams and team sites and everywhere else, the one on the intranet is going to be my final authoritative piece of content also. So once again, content, super, super important. One of the first things that we would do to start any intranet initiative, whether it's a new intranet or whether you're doing an intranet reboot. So now that we understand a little bit around information architecture as a whole, so the content, the users, and the context, how do we apply that now to SharePoint intranets? And when we think about SharePoint intranets in particular, there's really three main buckets, I guess, of information architecture exercises or pieces, which we're going to go through. The first one that we're going to talk about is site structure. So this is how your content is actually structured in these larger buckets throughout sites. And typically as well, that site structure is fairly closely tied into your navigation menu. So in SharePoint Online in particular, you can use things like hub site navigation as well as the mega nav capabilities through there. But really, you want to get a good understanding, that's that first piece of making sure that your site is structured effectively. The next thing in terms of information architecture for SharePoint intranets is around tags and categories, so metadata. And metadata can be really important in terms of categorizing content, but you can also use metadata in lots of different ways for your intranet. The ability to target content to particular users. It gives you the ability also to abstract content from the actual physical structure. So that can be really useful for things like roll-ups or sections where you're aggregating content across multiple sites or site collections. And then the last thing really is around landing pages. Let's think of landing pages as the pages that users land on. So once again, these could be hub sites or communication sites or the new home site capability. But the idea with landing pages is, once again, there needs to be some sort of structure to that page. So where should news go? Where should important links go, right? Where should some of the social things go? Where should updates go? All of these pieces we're going to talk about. So the first one is around site structure. And this is kind of a dirty little secret. I've probably done close to 100 intranet projects in the last 10 years. And what we've found, and if you look at some of the reports from some organizations like Nielsen Norman also, is that in most organizations, there's kind of common buckets of content. Now, it's not going to be perfect for every single organization, but the way that we typically see organizations group content together is along these 6 buckets. So the first one is content around what we call my working life. So think of this as the type of content that an individual or a user would look for related to them. So things like benefits, compensation, expenses. Typically, a lot of this is human resources based content also, but that's like a particular bucket of content. It's all the content related to me as an individual within the organization. The next one is around how we work. So typically, maybe that's called tools and resources, but all the things that I need to perform my job. So forms, templates, policies, procedures, applications, anything like that is this kind of second bucket of content that we find most organizations have. The third bucket is around what we call who we are. So this is all the information about the organization, vision and values, strategy, board members, about us, who we are, our history, all of this type of content, which I think is extremely powerful to have on an intranet. It helps from a cultural perspective to help users understand who the organization is and what they're doing. It also helps from an onboarding perspective where a user can go to, let's say, an intranet site there, and you have all the information about, who the organization are, the history, what they stand for. But that's that third type. The fourth type is the more traditional kind of dynamic content. We call it the what's going on, but news, events, spotlight items, announcements, right? All of that more traditional corporate communications piece. And then the last two, or the next one, is around shared services or departments. So this ability for you to see how the organization is structured and what the organization offers. Now, for some of it, these are going to be departments. In others, they're going to be things like divisions, depending on how the organization is structured. But one thing that I'm very, very I guess, strongly passionate about, is this idea that your intranet shouldn't be structured along your organizational structure, because organizational structures change fairly often. They often get renamed, and also end users typically don't think of content in terms of your organizational structure. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have departments on your intranet, but it shouldn't be the way that that top level or even that second level navigation is structured. However, there should always be a place for where a user can go in and see information about, those departments and shared services that an organization offers. And then the third, or the last piece here, is really what makes organizations unique. So this idea of lines of business, it's really what we do. So for a product-based organization on my intranet, typically I would have an area for each particular product with any collateral around that. Maybe there's marketing information around that particular product and insights. So if I'm that product-based organization, that's typically how that's structured. If I'm a services-based organization, so it's probably the types of services that we offer. Typically there's also quite a large knowledge management piece to that also. So here's how we do things, here's why we do things. And if you're a project-based organization as well, it's more around project best practices. So here's how we run projects, here's a list of projects that we're working on, reports, and everything else. Now, that doesn't mean that in some organization you might have a mix of these lines of business. You might be a product-based organization, but you're also running projects. But this is where we've found that it's quite different between organizations. And of course, in terms of labels, for those buckets, we also find that they can be fairly different. So remember how I talked about context previously? This really plays into the types of labeling that we want to use. So that my working life bucket of content, we've found that labels like employee essentials or working at the organization or working here really resonate from a user perspective. For how we work, things where we've seen that top level kind of category being called tools and resources, work tools, toolbox, those pieces, about who we are, about us, company info, our firm, what's going on, all of that corporate communications type of content, and news and announcements, news and events, corporate comms, and then shared services in terms of how we basically created departments, business units, and those things. So you can see how, the labels can, even though you're talking about the same bucket of content, depending on what those labels are, can really kind of influence, how users think about their organization also. And how this would look, just so you know, from a practical based perspective, let's say we've got an intranet, we've got an area called tools and resources as those top level items. Underneath tools and resources, you might have things like forms, policies, procedures, reports, templates. And then underneath those, you can even have third level items like agreements updated or most popular items through there. Now, in that third level, you definitely do not want to have every single link there. Excuse me, because what's going to happen is, your mega menu is going to go from this, size, which is pretty mega, to like this huge thing. But having the ability to have a little bit of, links to the most popular content within that third level can be useful. And I'll touch upon why landing pages can be super useful for that also. And then finally, in terms of those kind of IA best practices for navigation in particular. So you want to make sure that you label it clearly. So you don't want to use taglines or current company taglines too much. The other thing is you want to use short names. So we found there's a big trend for organizations to have top or second level category items where they have, tools and resources. And the next one is benefits and, let's say, human resources, and the third one is something, and you don't want to have too many ands in there. The reason for that is, once again, people tend to scan, so you want to have shorter names. You also want to organize by the type of content and not the ownership. That's why when I've done intranets, we've never, apart from a couple of cases, of course, structured it upon organizational guidelines. So it's not, human resources, IT, marketing, those things. It's more around the type of content that you have. Mutual exclusivity also. You want to make sure that you don't confuse users with similar labels. You want to make sure that those labels are at least from the top level, are what's called mutually exclusive. So you wouldn't have announcements as a top level item as well as news, because they're too similar, right? People wouldn't know where to go. And of course, the other thing is something called Miller's magic number. So Miller's magic number is by a researcher called Miller, who came up with this thing called the magic number, which is 7 plus or minus 2. And really, the idea is what he found is that once people, if you've got, let's say, 13 items in your top level navigation structure, once people scan past 7 plus or minus 2 items, so let's say 9, they tend to start forgetting the items that came beforehand. And that's why, like I said, what we're finding is there's a big trend currently to have what we call less wide information architectures. So instead of having like 30 items across the top level, or even 10 or 15, having them slightly deeper instead of wider. So deeper would be, you would have something like home, working here, tools and resources, departments, products and services, about us, and then underneath there you would have second and third level content through there. And this is, I think, one of the reasons that mega navs have become, I think, best practice from a UX perspective, is they kind of hold true to that Miller's magic number piece also. And then just the final thing about departments as well, like I said, I'm not saying not to have departmental based intranet sites there, you definitely should, but you shouldn't have your content organized around that department, that department side. Because once again, the reason for that is most of the time users don't think about content in terms of who owns it, but rather the type of content. So if I'm a user and I'm looking for, let's say, a form, I'm not thinking, okay, I'm looking for a form. Who owns this form? Is it marketing or human resources or benefits? Let's go there and look for it. I'm typically saying, I'm looking for a form. Show me where all the forms are, and then I can go through that process of finding them. And that's one of the reasons that, like I said, we try not to get users or organizations to do it around departments. So the next thing is around metadata. So we've talked about site structure. Let's now talk about metadata, or tags and categories. Metadata is something that, like I said, what metadata does, it provides context to content. And metadata is extremely powerful, not just from a document management perspective, where I think we typically think about that, but also from an intranet perspective. And the idea with metadata is that there's a couple of things. You can filter, you can sort, but the biggest thing that metadata allows you to do is to provide or present content independent of the physical location of that content. And it can do a lot of very, very powerful things. So the first example of this is using metadata to target content to users. So this ability, for instance, for audience targeting, or this ability to target particular types of news to individuals, is something that we've done all of the time on our intranets to give it a bit more of a personalized experience. So for instance, that ability for news to be targeted by topic or by business unit or by location can be really, really useful. The other thing you can also do is you can show personalized content based on user attributes also. So maybe you want to have, for each type of content that you have within your organization, you have something like even simple as like a topic associated to that. And then maybe you allow your users to subscribe to, let's say, a topic feed, which rolls up all of that content based on that topic also. So that first use for metadata that we find is really around the targeting piece, which is incredibly useful for intranets, particularly as you have large organizations. So the ability to land on an intranet homepage and use something like metadata or audience targeting to show me just all of the news for my particular location or business unit is very, very powerful. The next is around aggregation and filtering. So you can use metadata as well to aggregate content. So the best example of that is maybe you have forms and policies in different departmental areas within your intranet. If those forms and policies are tagged with a piece of metadata, so let's say once again it's topic, for instance, you can aggregate that content together and you can say, hey, show me all of the content across the entire intranet, which is based on industry best practices, or down the bottom here, new starter content, for instance. So this is that kind of the idea of metadata allowing you to have or metadata allowing you to show content independent of that physical location. And metadata, you don't need to have a huge amount there. I'll show you in just a moment what that typical set is. And the last thing, of course, is around filtering, right? So this ability to filter content, allowing users, particularly in more static types of content like document libraries, to go into filter content based on a particular piece of metadata. So of course, the next question is, well, from an intranet perspective, what type of metadata should I have and what metadata should be applied to that? And this is what we've found works fairly well. I'm, like I said, fairly pragmatic in nature. So a lot of organizations where they do an information architecture refresh, particularly around metadata, they'll come up with like 27 different types of metadata, right? And they expect that content author is going to go upload a document, for instance, somewhere on the intranet, and then there's like 27 pieces of metadata there which they have to fill out. There's no way that works. We've found that really, unless you can automate it, probably somewhere up to a maximum of 3 pieces of metadata is going to be that point where, you know, that point where friction starts to happen from a content authoring perspective. Like I said, what you want to do, you want to make that content authoring as easy as possible for your authors of your intranet. Otherwise, they're not going to put content in there, and then you've lost the battle before it started. So the types of metadata examples that we've frequently used. So the first one is around topics or tags. So once again, topics or tags is a nice broad level term you can use across all of your type of content within your intranet, whether it's document-based content, news, events, policies, procedures, forms, stories, pages, documents, whatever it is. Topic or tag can be a great way to be able to aggregate content. The other one is what we call around like product or service offering or knowledge area works really well. So that ability to tag a piece of content with, let's say, a product, and then use some of those aggregation or roll-up capabilities to say, show me all of the content, let's say, to do with this particular product, and aggregate that in one central area. Document type is frequently super important. So when I talk about document type, it's not like whether it's a docx file or a PDF file. Office 365 is going to give you that for free, but the type of content that it is: template, policy, proposal, contract, all of those types of things. And then the next thing, particularly around news and events and announcement categories, is kind of further categorize that news content. So, you know, you might have different types of news, like industry news, leadership messages, safety announcements. There's a few ways that you can do that within Office 365. You can use metadata, or you can have a site, for instance, which is which is designated as an authoritative site to provide those capabilities. So talked about news and metadata. So now let's quickly talk about landing pages. So when I talk about landing pages, the idea is that a landing page is any page that a visitor can land on that helps them guide through the guide, or give them a quick guide through a section of the site, and give them information or give them quick access to the information that they need. And in terms of that within Office 365, there's lots of different types of landing pages. So whether it's the new home site capability, things like hub sites, team sites, and communication sites also. And there's also, once again, some best practices in terms of how you can structure, or how you should structure that content also. So the first one is around what's called the F pattern. This is once again derived from research, and it helps you understand why most intranets or why most websites look fairly similar. So why is news always on the top left? Well, the reason for that is that's where people instinctively start their journey on a page. So the way that it works is it starts from the top left, it goes around that top row, and then once again you've got the kind of left hand. You go down one, and then to the right, and then down. Now, this is the reason that most intranets that you'll find will have news and events on the top left there, and then typically next to news and events, you'll have something like important links or quick links. The reason for that is that's a really good example of the type of content that's important to users, those quick links, and the type of content that's important to the intranet team or to the communication, which is news. But once again, if you're structuring your content, we found that the F pattern can be really, really useful in terms of, you know, how much priority you want to give to individual types of content on your intranet through here. And then finally, the other thing is in terms of content, you want your intranet, particularly your homepage or where users start, to be fairly dynamic in nature. And what we've done and what Office 365 and SharePoint Online does really well is this concept of dynamic content. So if you're a smaller organization, generating news and events every single day or multiple times a day can be pretty problematic. But that's okay. You can use dynamic content, particularly if you've got metadata there, to kind of generate that content automatically for you. So things like, most viewed, most liked, recently modified and newest content can be really, really useful. Of course, you get that dynamic content with things like the news web part within Office 365, as well as the highlighted content. But the idea is, like I said, if you want your users coming back to the Intranet homepage, the Intranet homepage is not a static website. It's more like a news site. So you want that content to be created and to be, fairly regularly updated. One of the ways that you can cheat a little bit is to have dynamic content on here. The other way that you can cheat as well is if you've got some social feeds for your organization, you can plug those in through something like the Twitter web part, and that gives you some dynamic things as well. So we've gone through that, and I've gone through a little bit quickly because we started a little bit late. But the next is in terms of information architecture activities. So this all sounds good, but the biggest question that you should be asking when you're doing any information architecture exercise is this one. So how can we be sure that people can actually find the content that they need on your intranet? And amazingly, I think a lot of people spend a lot of time making the intranet look nice, spending a whole bunch of time in branding. But this is really the whole point of your intranet. You want that intranet to be structured in a way so people can find what they need when they need it in the quickest possible time, regardless of whether it's news, events, or more of that, tools and resources-based information. And there's actually a way that you can do this even before you build anything. And this is one of the great things. So I have a fairly well-defined process that I follow when doing an information architecture exercise. And like I said, I've done this with organizations of 100 people and all the way up to 200,000 people. And this is the typical process that I follow just to get to that site structure piece. So the first one that we've talked about is around a content audit. Now, a content audit is the least fun thing to do when you're doing an intranet project, but it's also the most important thing, right? Without understanding the type of content that you have, it's going to be really difficult to come up with any sort of structure. Now, an intranet content audit is typically you want to understand the types of content that you have or you want on your intranet. You want to see if that content exists already. You want to go through the process of whether it's going to be kept, rewritten, or deleted. But really the idea is for you to understand all of the content that you have, how much of it is going to have to be rewritten or repurposed, and also making sure that you've got owners for each particular type of content. Because what you'll find on an intranet is if you have content and it's not owned by someone, it's not going to be kept up to date. And what the intranet content audit does is then it gives you input into the first task that you want to perform. Now, this is what's called a card sort. I'm not sure if anyone's been through this process, but a card sort is something that we always do. And what this does, it helps us understand how users think about groups of information within their organization. Now, we used to do this in person. Now we do it online. But the idea is you take 50 to 60 high value pieces of content within your organization. Then what you do, you can either do it in person. In person, you're writing out physical cards and people are drawing on them. Or alternatively, you can use tools, which I'll show in just a moment. And what your users do is then they go and then they drag the different types of content into these different buckets. Now, in terms of card sorts, there's two types of card sorts, so there's three, but there's two main types. You can do something called an open card sort where users will go in and create their own categories and put that content in there. Alternatively, you can do something called a closed card sort where you define categories for them, like in this case, or you can do something called a hybrid card sort where you start with some categories, but then users can also have the option to create their own. What this allows you to do, it allows you to understand how users group content together. So a good example is, let's say it's a form. Do users in the organization think of forms as, okay, we think of forms first, so we'll have a bucket of content called forms and all the forms sit underneath that? Or do users think of organization of their forms in terms of the department first, and then those forms individual to that particular department? That's really important information to know, because that's really going to help you define that site structure and everything else through here. Preparing for a card sort, it's pretty easy. You need to have that content audit. You also need to, like I said, speak to your end users, because it's a combination of the content that we have and also the types of tasks that they're going to perform. Typically, it's somewhere between 50 to 80 cards. Like I said, you might want to decide on some top level categories, and then you want to have some email communication to all of the participants also. So fairly simple and fairly easy. So the way that this looks like from the perspective of tools, there's a number of different tools that you can use. We use one called Optimal Workshop. This tool for us has been really successful. It's not particularly expensive. We've found it's really robust. Just so you know, the largest card sort exercise that we have ever ran, we got 47,000 responses, right? Wow. So in that case, then we have the organization was close to 220,000 people, but that gives us a lot of data, right? It's not just the intranet team, and you could have 20 super smart people within a room. We might come up with a structure that we think is great, but it might not work. But this is the first step to doing this. So the way that card sorts work is pretty simple. So let's try the study here. So this tool allows you to define those cards. So these are just some questions that they're asking beforehand, but let's get to the card sort itself. So basically what this allows you to do is I can go put things and I can start renaming them. So this is ringtones, for instance. But once again, what users will do is then they'll start to create categories of content that they want to see. Once you go through this, you get these results views. And the reason for this, the reason that we use this, it's super powerful because you start to understand how many categories people are creating across all of those users. And it also gives you a lot of information in terms of the categories that people have created, something called a standardization grid, which kind of helps you understand for each particular card which bucket of content they put it into. And there's a bunch of other stuff which we're not going to go into. But really the idea is that it gives you a really good understanding of how those users group content together, right? This is a fantastic tool to once again help you understand, well, how are people grouping that content? Once you have that, you can start off and doing your site structure. So with all the information we get from the card sort in terms of how people are thinking about content and how it's structured, it provides a great place to start off with your site structure. So let's say we've done a card sort, we've come up with this site structure. Our top level sites are employee essentials for all our employee stuff, tools and resources, an area for department, an area about us, and then directories also. So if this is our navigation structure, once again, this is great, but how do we know this is going to work, right? Now, there's one way that we could do this. We can spend a whole bunch of time and money building this and then just wait for feedback. We found that doesn't work particularly well because it doesn't matter how good your site structure is. People are always going to be annoyed because there's change. Maybe we can test that, and there is. So this is another tool, once again, that we use, and it's called tree testing. Tree testing is the generic term. Once again, in that Optimal Workshop tool, there's a bunch of tools around that, which I'll show you. But the idea with tree testing is you're trying to use it to evaluate the findability of topics on an intranet. And what you're basically doing is you're giving your navigation structure, you're inputting your navigation structure into this tool, and then you're asking people a series of questions. And those questions are typically the tasks that people are trying to do. What happens then, a user will go in, they'll see the question, they'll say, well, I think I'm going to find it in this area, and then the tool is going to track everything for you. This is by far the best way to get a really good understanding of, is that navigation structure that we've created, are those buckets of content actually something that resonate with people? Now, from
I'm just going to let you know that we're running short on time. We do have one question, and I have an announcement at close.
Perfect. So just give me one more minute here, and we'll be
sure.
done.
That's totally fine.
Fine. So from the tree testing piece, once again, the idea with this capability, whoops, is, oh, let's go back here. So once again, from this tree testing piece, the idea with this is, once again, you've got all of your capabilities here. You can see exactly who did what. So let's go back to demos, tree test, view the results. So it's the same sort of idea that we had previously. For each particular tasks that you have, you can see once again the time taken, how people found that topic, whether it's successful or not. And once again, this gives you that ability there to be able to see exactly how people found content and what it was there. So hopefully, I know we started a little bit late, and I do apologize. That's totally my fault, nothing on the organizers. Hopefully this gives you a little bit of an idea of broad level information architecture. How can it also be applied to SharePoint intranets? And like I said, if you haven't used these tools, Optimal Workshop is where you want to go. Great set of tools that you can use to, like I said, come up with your navigation, test that navigation also. And there's another 3 to 4 tools there as well, which is really going to help you. So with that, I will turn it back over.
Okay. Well, we have 2 questions. Are you ready? Okay. Should you consistently change your top level navigation, or should it be static?
So the top level navigation, I think, should be pretty static. It's one of the reasons that having a less kind of departmental focused navigation works really well. I think the items underneath can change a little bit, but you want that top level navigation to be pretty consistent. Otherwise, if that's constantly changing, people are just going to get confused in terms of, you know, where they need to or where they can find content.
How many users as a percentage should be involved in architecture activities?
Good question. So we typically were striving to get 20% of the organization as a minimum involved. It's obviously a little bit harder for larger organizations because if you've got 200,000 people, getting 40,000 people to go through even one of these things, it might take them 10 minutes. That's a lot of time. But yeah, anywhere around 20% works really well. Obviously, the more data, the better. And really, any data is going to be better than 0.
Okay, last question. How on cost of those 2 tools that you were showing on the tree testing and the card sorting, if you can provide that information.
Oh yeah, we can do it here. It's pretty cheap, to be honest with you. Like we found it even for like an individual monthly thing, it's $166. So it's pretty cheap. And what you can do is if your intranet project is only 3 months, you just sign up for 3 months. So it's definitely, for the capabilities that this tool offers, I think it's really, really great value.
Fantastic. That's all the questions, and thank you so much. Next up is our closing announcements and raffle prizes. That's happening not on this link, but it's in the Eagle Room. I will post a link to the Eagle Room in the Q&A chat, so everybody has access to that. There you go. Thank you so much. Don't forget to leave feedback for the sessions and the overall for the speakers on the individual sessions and for the overall conference. Thank you.